What up, Coordination? How you doing? On the pod today, we're discussing whether Web3 is the new Occupy Wall Street, how Web3 relates to Occupy Wall Street, why it matters, and what we have to learn in the Web3 space from the Occupy Wall Street movement. So on the pod, we have Sarah Baxendell from the Regen Network, been in Web3 for several years, has done a bunch of stuff with permaculture, also was involved in Occupy Wall Street back in the day. We have Benjamin Life, who works in the independent political sector and was a social impact filmmaker, also involved in Occupy Wall Street back in the day. So we talk about where Web3, Occupy Wall Street align and share DNA as social movements, and also where they detract from each other and how they take different approaches to the various movements that they're in. And we also talk about the limits of being able to make those types of comparisons because both are decentralized, distributed movements, and it's hard to talk in generalizations about any of them. So I think that when we're talking about Regen Web3 and Web3 for social change, taking a look at a movement that happened a generation before us with Occupy Wall Street is a really fruitful exercise. And so I think that you're really going to enjoy this podcast with Sarah and Ben. Enjoy.
Working in Web3 is awesome. It's freeing, powerful, and so much fun. But working outside of the typical W-2 employee structure is a deal breaker for so many people. OPOLIS is helping the self-sovereign worker focus on what they do best, their work, while OPOLIS manages the back end. There's a lot of nation-state overhead when working in Web3, and OPOLIS takes care of all of the back end stuff, freeing you up to do what you do best, your work. OPOLIS leverages group buying power through a community employment co-op, helping you save 20 to 50% on high-quality, affordable healthcare options through Cigna. So do what you love and maintain your financial security with OPOLIS. You must be authorized to work inside the United States to receive OPOLIS's benefits, but OPOLIS is expanding its services to Canada starting on June 1st of next year. So book a 30-minute free consultation with OPOLIS experts and join OPOLIS by December 31st to get 1,000 work and 1,000 bank tokens. Go to connect.opolis.co/bankless to get started. COINSHIFT is a leading treasury management and infrastructure platform for DAOs and crypto businesses that need to manage their treasury operations. Every crypto org needs to manage its treasury, and COINSHIFT offers a simple, flexible, and efficient multi-chain treasury management platform built on top of the highly secure Gnosis Safe. With COINSHIFT, your organization can go from primitive single-chain treasury management to expressive, flexible, and multi-chain treasury features, such as global user management, global contacts, proposal management, and many other features that can be shared across an entire organization, allowing users to save time and reduce operational burdens and gas costs. COINSHIFT even has data tools like account reporting across the 7 chains on which it operates. Used by industry powerhouses such as Uniswap Grants, Balancer, Consensus, and Messari, COINSHIFT is speeding up the coordination and efficiency of the organizations that use it. You have to keep up with the frontier, and COINSHIFT makes that easy. So sign up at coinshift.xyz/bankless.
What's up, y'all?
Hey.
Hi.
So glad to have you. Let's maybe start off with a couple of quick intros. Sarah, you want to go first?
Sure. My name is Sarah Baxendell. I'm here today holding 2 lenses. One is I was an organizer for the Occupy Wall Street New York City Sustainability Working Group. And the other is in the world of Web3. I currently work as director of ecosystem for Regen Network. So I'm going to try to hold a little bit of past and present perspective in today's conversation.
Great. Ben, you want to go next?
Yeah, my name is Benjamin Life. I was at the Boston Occupy, and as of late, I've been working in the U.S. independent political sector for an organization called the Independent National Union, working to organize political independence for good governance. And then I also work on a project called Open Civics, which is trying to bring together systems architects and community organizers and elected officials to help redesign systems at the local level.
Beautiful. Well, I'm really excited to have this conversation with you all today. The topic is this really obnoxious tweet that I sent that said Web3 is the new Occupy Wall Street, which, created some debate on Twitter. But, the things that I see are that there's a lot of ex-Occupy Wall Street people building in Web3. And because of that, we have a lot of being able to think differently and swim against the mainstream current. There's a focus in this space on group collective intelligence over hierarchy, and to focus on Wall Street and its financial rails but building an open source financial system that's an alternative to Wall Street for a new generation. And those are the parallels that I saw between Occupy Wall Street and Web3 that caused me to send that really obnoxious tweet. But I think that the three of us were kind of debating in the replies the merits of the parallel, and I felt like it was an important conversation and worth having in a more high context environment than on Twitter replies. So, Sarah, maybe I'll go to you first just to tee things off. What is your reaction to the statement Web3 is the new Occupy Wall Street?
My reaction was a lot of resistance, personally. And I was thinking about this morning. I think a lot of this really roots in what we're using as our description of Web3. If we're talking about the social impact corner of Web3, the environmental impact corner of Web3, I think that there are more parallels to the underlying ethos of Occupy Wall Street than if you look at crypto or Web3 at large. But I think at a pattern level of humans and organizing and decision-making and decentralization, no matter what use case we're taking a look at, there are a lot of parallels to what really happened in a natural, organic, and unexpected way in Ducati Park in regards to how people gather, how they make decisions. And I think that there's really a big difference between what it's like to be in a crowd of 5,000 people making a decision and what it's like to be, on the internet, on Twitter, on a Commonwealth forum, having an opinion. The discourse and the environment of that and the energy of that, to me, are really fundamentally different lived experiences. So I'm excited to dig in because I think there's some similarities and some differences that I do think are really important to tease out.
Yeah, where I completely agree with you at the experiential level and maybe even at the cultural level, there's some really important parallels or distinctions. The reason I feel like Web3 is in some ways an evolution of Occupy is around what Occupy was trying to achieve. And there was this rise in awareness of the inherent systemic corruption of our financial system. And yet the kind of means of redress of that grievance was an encampment that struggled to actually create an alternative or to get a new financial system that could solve a lot of those grievances. And so I think it was an important cultural moment of bringing awareness to the brokenness of our financial system. But where I see Web3 continuing that arc is actually being able to provide the infrastructure that would create the foundation for a new economic system that could have different design principles than our current one. And I think we're seeing with things like FTX that a lot of the principles of decentralization have been kind of lost in the early commodification of Web3. But I think at the primitives level, we have a lot more tools that we can work with to actually achieve the goals of Occupy now than we did in 2011.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I mean, I think for me, the part that I get stuck on really comes down to what is the point of Web3? And if you take a look at the vast majority of Web3, it really is about something distinctly to do with the financial system. It's a DeFi exchange. It's some sort of dApp. It's really focused, frankly, on people making money. Whereas Occupy was focused on having a radical disruption experience that was very direct action oriented, both in the park and in the marches and the actual street activism that was really associated with that experience. And what it was trying to do there in the financial district was say the underlying structure of capitalism as a concept is sick. It is a sickness that is cultural, that is really evolved across the entire globe. And so to me, I struggle to get over that hurdle in comparison, because I do think that the vast majority of Web3 activity is about individuals making money. And there's all these components that really do reflect an evolution from Occupy. The holding of your own keys, the decentralization of validators on proof of stake chains, the decentralized decision-making mechanism, the fact that you can jump into a protocol and write your own smart contract. There's a lot of decentralization and autonomy inside of the Web3 systems that we work with on a technical level. But to me, the vast majority of that is still about people making money first and foremost. And in the occupation, that was not the goal. The goal was not for the people that showed up to make money. And because of that, there were millions and millions of dollars of donations that came in. And then there were consensus mechanisms that were enormously public that anybody could join about how that money should be distributed. So for me, I think that's the real struggle. And I think about it on the level of art. I think about it on the level of intention. I think about it in the level of what are we building and why. And being from a protocol that is environmental rails, financial solutions for environmental impact, you know, the financialization component is there as well. So I do think finance is this universal thread of Web3, but I do wonder if the overall whole Web3 space is more just decentralized capitalism than a true evolution.
I think that that's a really interesting take. I mean, the way I'm viewing this in my mind is that there's like the Web3 movement, which is just decentralized immutable ledgers that you can program your values into. And there's like one circle there. And then there's like, it's almost like a Venn diagram. The other circle is a bunch of Occupy Wall Street alumni who are now seeing this as an opportunity to meet the ends that they had with Occupy Wall Street, but just on new rails. And it's only within the intersection of those Venn diagrams that Occupy Wall Street, or with it, Web3 is the new Occupy Wall Street, and the outside of that Venn diagram on the Web3 side is like just more capitalism, and unfortunately, there's like FTX collapses and scams that are out there too. And so maybe within that Venn diagram, that's where Web3 is the new Occupy Wall Street. But I do think that within that intersection, there is some really interesting opportunity space for doing things that maybe would have felt naive 12 years ago, for creating real systemic change. And that's why I'm excited about this conversation.
The one thing about the hyper financialization that I think is interesting to track is we've never been in this part of the cycle before. I mean, I haven't been in crypto long enough to have seen as many of the bear bull cycles that I think maybe both of you have. But I'm curious if the way that this cycle is changing the dynamics of crypto itself might, I don't know if the staking protocols that were so wildly all over the place in the last cycle, if those will make it through this market. I'm curious if the way that the regulatory space is shifting, if it'll be possible for that hyper financialization to continue. And I admit, I myself got lost in it. I thought it was going to be the best social impact funding strategy that would ever exist. It was like free money. But then you look at the underlying principles, and it's all not really real. Like there's no real value that's being created there. And so in the same way that I think capitalism is destroying itself, I think the hyper financialization kind of already destroyed itself in Web3. And I'm curious to see if that aspect of Web3 makes it through this next phase. And, the meme of the degen to regen pipeline, like I'm curious how many degens through this cycle will actually move into more of the refi space.
Yeah, and refi as a use case aside, I think for me, this is just my personal opinion, having been here for a couple of years, I think the most interesting thing about blockchain is application-specific use case potential and the fundamental transparency of the data set, the democratization of participation, the autonomy of holding your own keys. To me, I think that we're gonna have to, as a culture and as a blockchain community, really make a choice to showcase these real world use cases. if we can't make a strong enough industry-wide argument that blockchain has real-world use cases and can be a real value proposition on a global level, we are going to get out-regulated. There's just no way around that. And for me, I was thinking about this earlier about, I was thinking in terms of police, because when I got down to Occupy Wall Street, to be completely honest, it was an absolute accident. I thought Radiohead was playing. Someone sent me like a one-sentence email straight up, and now I got there. They were like, "Radiohead is playing this park. You should go." I was like, "I'm not gonna do it."
That's a great Occupy origin story.
Dude,
by the
it
way,
was a total universe accident. I had no idea. It was crazy. But I ended up in this march to the police headquarters in New York City, and the energy of the experience. And at the time, I didn't even know what police brutality was in my, upper middle class New England white privilege. It wasn't, a worldview that I had come from. And I was thinking this morning about the system aggression I saw at Occupy, the people who the police curb stomped, the fingers and hands I saw broken, the ripping apart of direct action activists linked together arm to arm on bridges, and comparing that as like a social subjugation to the lack of federal action around collapses like FTX really makes me question intention around our industry from a regulatory level, because I think there's so much Wall Street capital in all of the investment, in all of the exchanges, and in all of the organizations that to some extent, I actually think that they're afraid to regulate, and they've been afraid to regulate for a long time. So I really think that the whole point of blockchain is the social organizing mechanism, a social decision-making mechanism, a social graph, a trust graph, a truth graph. And we have a real responsibility more than anything else to tell the stories of our use cases in our communities and build honest and authentic technology that will outlive us. Because to me, a lot of the Occupy Wall Street notes are lost somewhere in a Google group that if I work hard enough, I could probably find the password to, but none of that as a historical record is public. None of that decision-making is something that everyone can get access to. So I do think we're at a different social evolution point in this juncture. And I really look forward to how we communicate our use cases and how we build public consensus about them. The one thing I walked away with more than anything from Occupy is a love of public decision-making and like a real willingness to be like radically vulnerable in a pile of people making decisions and helping people make decisions. And I think we have a real opportunity to build a shared governance culture and a shared decision-making culture that I don't think we put enough time and energy into. We put energy into DeFi exchanges and getting our little rewards. And we've all participated. Let's not pretend like we're not up in there reaping all the APRs that were so crazy. But I think it demands something more of us on a soul level. And so I'm kind of excited about the bear market because I just think that we can evolve why we're here and our intentions more authentically when we're not stuck in a hype cycle.
And I think the social dimension of governance is something that the DAO space is still learning. And yet there's this whole other body of work and people who've been doing that kind of stuff and they haven't been in the Web3 space. And that intersection is really interesting to me because DAOs create a kind of back end for distributed decision making, but like what the social process is to scaffold the integration of perspectives and listening to each other and finding decisions that are actually more consensus based than like first past the post voting or reputation based. But when I imagine Occupy happening again now, empowered by DAOs and to actually be able to collectively raise and hold funds to pay for the medics, to pay for food, it feels like it would accelerate Occupy if it were to happen again, to have those tools. And it might actually improve Web3 because a lot of people who are in the social process space could actually integrate that wisdom into the Web3 tech stack.
One of the things that I've been studying as a technologist for the last couple decades is technology trends. And there's this thing called the Gartner hype cycle, in which you have some sort of trigger that creates a peak of inflated expectations. And then that collapses and you go into this thing called the trough of disillusionment. And then you get into what's called the slope of enlightenment, and then there's this thing called the plateau of productivity. And this is sort of something that assumes that the technology gets through the trough of disillusionment. In reality, there's a bunch of different technologies that just stay in the disillusionment trough forever because there's never a slope of enlightenment. And I'm wondering if, I'm kind of just thinking about that as a cyclical way that movements happen. And just thinking about the peak of inflated expectations that happened with Occupy Wall Street, in which there was a lot of really amazing momentum and social change and probably inflated expectations for what was possible. And then when the camps were all broken up by the police and we all moved on, then that was a trough of disillusionment. And if the integration of Occupy Wall Street and DAO era tools can kind of be the maturing of the movement and a plateau of productivity, I guess, Benjamin, I'm just saying back to you what you said, where if Occupy was on DAO-based rails, then it could do way more and probably be more productive than otherwise noted. Like, I don't know. I guess maybe the question that I'll tee back to you is: are there any theories of systems or social movement maturation that fit your modeling, and how does my comments about the Gartner hype cycle resonate with y'all?
Yeah, that you bring up a really important paradigm shift that I think I want to unpack some more, which is that even in my example of what a new Occupy could do with DAOs, the only use cases I gave were things relative to protest. Like, how do you run an effective protest? And where I'm really interested to go is in part of the paradigm shift is, instead of organizing people to use our voices to delegitimize a system like the Federal Reserve or capitalism itself or the banking industry, I think we have the potential of galvanizing that energy of needing change into actually building parallel systems and structures instead of protesting things. And there's this really incredible organization called the Bloom Network, and they're building on Web3, but they're mostly focused on like actually improving quality of life in place. And so they, build community gardens and they do after school programming, and they're this very post-capitalist, anti-capitalist organization, but they're not protesting anything. And I think that's a really interesting paradigm shift with Web3, where the kind of solar punk ethos of like, well, this whole thing is screwed and failing. What would we build if we actually wanted to build a society that was equitable? And with Web3, we can actually just start to do that instead of protesting, the brokenness of our current institutions.
I want to add some parallels from my own experience, because I actually think it's a back and forth that happens to everybody on an individual level. So, when I was in Zuccotti Park, sustainability working group only gave a crap about the earth. Like, I literally found it because someone had painted the earth on a piece of just whatever. And I was like, this has got to be where my people are. And I just kept harassing people at this little earth picture until I figured out where the meeting was. Like, there was you had to be aggressive to find your way into what you were after there. And through that process, that's how I became a permaculture designer. There were folks that were building green water systems or gray water systems for the kitchen that I started to help with, that are these amazing organizers in New England. I got to go to all of these classes. We replanted all of Zuccotti Park. We started to take all of the compost out to community gardens on bicycle. We developed bicycle generator systems that ran all of the power for press and media. And then eventually, when we got rated, and I do think we got rated because of us, this is my theory. In the end, I think we got rated because we had developed a decentralized power system that the people could bike on themselves after they turned the power off in the park as a way to try to scamper us out of there. Because it was the night that we distributed the final 14 bikes that they got rated. So I afterwards I became a designer, I became a solutions architect, and spent a whole decade building farms, building gardens, helping communities decide how to redesign their park, re-envisioning public space through group design and public decision-making process. I mean, there were 25,000 people participated in decisions for the parks that I was a planner for in the city of Pittsburgh for almost 7 years. And now I work at Regen, and I find that I have this new desire to protest. And it's not that I would go in the street, but I think being comfortable enough, being vulnerable, and speaking up is a really critical aspect of intervening in our complacency. And now that I have more technical experience under my belt, I can explain to you how all the different blockchains work and how the assets move in the architecture and decision making and the code in a way that that's not my background. I find this new arrival at a point of saying, in these cycles that we're in, we have to speak up and not be complacent. And so our voice and our creation is in fact protest, as well as it is building the rails that are fundamentally necessary to build a new economic system. And my question is really like, what is our shared value set? Can we build one? Can we have a collective cross-protocol, cross-whatever consensus process around what we think that our value set is? Because I fear that, the occupation had its principles, it had its little pamphlet. You knew what everybody thought they were there for. And in that park, there was the beating drum, like literally the guys that they took it on themselves to literally have a drum circle for like 6 months straight. Like nobody stopped drumming, no matter what time of day it was, to the point where you were begging them to stop. But what is our heartbeat as a community? What are we here to build? And how do we build cross-organizational consensus around what that mechanism should look like in a way where we can be decentralized, but we can come together with a shared ethos? I'm looking for that shared ethos being this far along in this journey. And I'm looking for how we build shared ethos across whose tech is best and whose protocol is flyest, or who thinks they're, fanciest on the deck here. I want to know what we all want to create in the world together and find ways for us all to work together and build that consensus. To me, that's really the golden nugget for us as a community moving forward.
I've been using this phrase and largely inspired by Kevin about civic hyperstructures. The phrase hyperstructure, and you put civic in front of it. There's something about like, how do we facilitate the process of alignment between different social groups and actors? One thing I noticed in your share was just how intensified the political polarization and the identity politics has become in the last 10 years since Occupy. And it's actually even hard for me to imagine that kind of pluralistic or diverse of a group of people in one movement today. It feels like you have to be part of more of a niche movement context in order to speak the same language and be seen as on the in group of that. And so I don't have an answer for this, but I feel like, is there a sort of social architecture that could utilize Web3 to help build the nodes of the movement and the connections between those nodes? Because it feels like we actually are all rooted in, at some levels, there's certain universal principles. I come back to life and quality of life as a kind of universal principle. Like, we're all going to have different experiences of what quality of life means to us. But if we can collectively say we actually want to create an economic system that improves the well-being of people and communities, then that creates at least some kind of a shared value system. But then there's going to be a lot to metabolize to actually come into alignment as a larger movement together. And so I don't have the answer for this, but I'm curious how technology might be able to scaffold the process of depolarization and helping people find those shared value systems.
One of the things we talk about a lot when I was at Gitcoin is this idea of cooperation across social distance. So basically, cooperation across distance is basically like, if we're not in the same social network, but we can still cooperate on something. And that's like the opposite of tribalism and being in our own little echo chambers. And so, I think that's definitely one really component of coalition building, and in doing it across DAOs, across layer ones, across tribes, I think is a really important thing. And I think that maybe what we're building towards here is Nathan Schneider, who's also an occupier who's Web3 adjacent now, talks a lot about how in the web has gotten really good at disrupting power by creating protest, but it hasn't really gotten good at holding power. And I think that that's maybe one maturation point that we really need to see is creating systems that are stable and can hold power and still be legitimate in if Occupy was to move on to Web3 rails. And it seems like Occupy was really good at disrupting power, or at least creating a social movement that felt like it could disrupt power. What would it look like to hold power as the generation that went through Occupy matures is kind of the question at the tip of my tongue.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think it rests on social coordination. And just a good example of where I felt like this happened just really beautifully and magically this fall. This is just a very distinct thing that happened. The blockchain infrastructure carbon offsetting working group has been trying to like gather all the refi homies for, a year. And it never felt so alive as when we all met in Coconut, Colombia in person and actually got to see each other face to face and actually got to develop real relationships and actually got to talk about what does technological interoperability look like to us and how can we really work together? What's our shared values? How can we share resources? How can we have shared decision making? How can we map a bigger system that we want to create together? So I think part of power is being connected in community, and being willing to sort of take your boundaries down about being bigger, better, best. But I also think power is money because money reflects intention and focus, and finding a way to further and deepen the capitalization of these blockchain for good, whether it's social good or environmental good or other good use cases, I think they're really expanding the capital investment into those spaces and finding ways to really fund those economic models is largely going to be critical to us having power. You don't have power unless you have place, unless you have position. And a lot of that still rests on this investment capital cycle that, again, comes back to that 99% thing. And are we going to be bankers or are we going to be the bankless? And how do we negotiate and navigate between outside forces and forces of ourselves? Because I think we create so much value that in my mind is worth so much more to our social and planetary evolution than like the big DeFi protocols that have a lot of, total value left. I want to see like total value captured into social organization and into resilient systems. And that requires a real evolution, but it also requires a big capital investment as a value proposition in our ecosystems.
Yeah, it feels like the maturation of both how we approach the strategy of the movement, realizing that at a structural level, we are in some ways forced to play into some amount of financialization of even social impact. And yet there's ways that we can do that in a more ethical way that's aligned with our principles and values. But we're not just doing it for free in our spare time. We're actually building models where people can be remunerated for taking pro-social actions. And as far as like making it real and actually holding power, I was reminded of the experiment of Redemption DAO, which, if you weren't tracking, it was similar to Constitution DAO. People trying to raise money to buy land in the Congo, and there's a lot of complex intersectional conversation we could have around colonization and the kind of naivete of some of the organizers who weren't aware of just how challenging it is to work with the government in the Congo. But it came from this like deep, I felt it myself, of like reading in the New York Times, this giant area of rainforest is going to be extracted, and the amount of carbon that's released from the peatlands alone in that area, let alone the fossil fuels that will be burned, that will be extracted from that place. It was so viscerally disturbing that I got the impulse of why people wanted to raise as many millions as possible in a very short period of time to buy that land and put it into a trust. And so I think where things get really real is like, can we hold things of value together and direct those flows of value into different value systems that are non-extractive? And I, for all of the amount of times that like frontline ecological protesters go and like cut the lines and do kind of direct action to disrupt fossil fuel extraction, what if on the other side of that, there are a group of refi investors who are going to buy the contracts to those natural resources to keep them in the ground? Is that a strategic necessity at this point? If we found that the wheels of capitalism keep turning, no matter how many people put their bodies in front of it to try to get it to stop, do we actually have to use capitalism to end capitalism? And that's the inquiry I'm in.
I think I've settled long ago on yes. Like I am not afraid to admit that I am a capitalist trained in financial capitalism at a corporate level who is unafraid to use those mechanisms for good. I mean, to give you a stat, I spent 10 years helping people develop their projects, developing projects of my own, developing projects for cities. I've raised over $30 million as somebody who just helps people raise money in that time period. So I like to, the phrase I use with like Gregory from Regen is I like to call it composting capital. I'm not afraid to use the structural mechanism to say, okay, cool. How do we take those funds and put them into something really extraordinary that is going to change many different people's lives? And, I would love for us to have $100 billion fund that there's a consensus mechanism where leadership across all these organizations in the blockchain space work to have decision-making processes and bring communities of practice into those decision-making practices and actually move capital into building the solutions that we want to see. I think that's possible, but it requires a willingness for all of our leaders in this ecosystem to work together, to largely take time out of their days, to work together to raise funding at a scale that allows us to have control over the solutions architecture and the decision-making architecture. And, I would love to see that be possible. And hearing this in myself out loud, I wonder if maybe that's part of my next wave of service in Web3 is pushing that dial beyond, the stratified lines of who we work for and whose tech we build into how do we movement build and capitalize solutions-oriented movement building in a way that is authentic and transparent and collective. I think that could really change a lot of things around the world if we were focused and coordinated collectively.
The world has woken up to refi, and CELO is here for it. CELO is the layer one for the regenerative finance movement. It's fast, planet positive, and built for the real world. CELO has committed to producing a sustainable future from day one and has built its technology around one of the lowest carbon impact consensus mechanisms and is the world's first carbon negative EVM compatible layer one blockchain. CELO is a movement to create the conditions of prosperity for everyone, whether it's tokenizing carbon credits with Toucan, providing capital to underserved communities with Unicorn, or building for millions of users around the globe. CELO was created to transform crypto enthusiasts into a movement of changemakers. Follow along on Twitter @CELO.org to learn more about how CELO is accelerating refi for a positive, lasting impact on people, communities, and the planet. And if you're a builder interested in refi, be sure to join the Build with CELO hackathon live now with a prize pool of over $100,000. GOLDFINCH is a decentralized credit protocol with a mission to connect the world's capital to the world's growth. GOLDFINCH focuses on real yields from real companies, so start lending your USDC to real businesses driving growth worldwide. GOLDFINCH's borrowers are proven fintechs and credit funds in emerging markets who need access to GOLDFINCH's capital to drive economic growth in regions faced with barriers to financial access. In just under 2 years, GOLDFINCH has loaned over 100 million USDC, reaching over 1 million people and businesses across 28 countries. GOLDFINCH is doing what DeFi was always meant to do, expanding financial access to those who have historically been shut out of the TradFi system. So, become a GOLDFINCH member to put your USDC to work, empowering real businesses' growth. Join GOLDFINCH's new member vaults to be an active investor and take part in supporting GOLDFINCH's security and expansion. Receive yield enhancements generated by protocol revenue, plus access exclusive communication channels and more. So go to goldfinch.finance to get started.
What y'all said about, what was it? Using capitalism to end capitalism kind of reminds me of, there's this Winston Churchill quote about how democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried. And I kind of feel like the same way about capitalism, is that it's the worst form of economic systems except for all the other ones. Um, and so that leads me to, okay, we can now program money. Why don't we try some more economic systems, so that we can create an evolution of capitalism that's more regenerative. And the stuff that we put in the GreenPilled book is going from just like creating rewards for now me, but like in more of like a bentoist type of system, which creates rewards for now us and for future us. A type of capitalism that rewards value creation instead of just value extraction, removes the incentive to externalize harm. I think that decentralized markets are a really powerful tool for allocating capital, but we just need to, it's like they need to be oriented in the right direction. And I feel like that's the opportunity of the space. And also maybe creating little local bubbles isn't the right word, but local economies that are oriented around public goods or permaculture or civic spaces, and allowing them to have their own value systems and capital that finance them feels like a huge opportunity for this space. So I don't know if that's Occupy being the new Web3, but it feels like it's an opportunity for Occupy organizers to use Web3 to realize some very Occupy like ends. So I don't know, curious your reaction to that, if any.
The one addition I would make is the change to our relationship to climate change and ecological collapse, the kind of trophic cascades of the sixth mass extinction. For me, I look at ecological collapse as a kind of heuristic of systems design. So what are the core human needs that need to be designed for in these parallel systems to minimize human suffering as globalized supply chains begin to fracture and fail? And I think that can actually help orient our building towards the things that actually are needed at the grassroots level to create healthy communities, instead of this sort of abstraction of like, let's try a bunch of different things. Like, let's definitely experiment. But I think having a kind of design space that's like, how do we work on local food? How do we ensure that we have clean water? How do we put more of our community land into trust and have funding to rehabilitate areas that have been really profoundly extracted from? And those kind of heuristics, I feel like, are the kind of where it grounds in, and it's not just sort of the abstraction of making any type of system. It's like, how do we design using Web3 to account for the core human needs?
So, I mean, as someone who's in this movement, and, maybe I know more about it than most from doing 70 episodes of this podcast, and like, it feels like those experiments are happening. I mean, I'm looking at the Regen network, I'm looking at Proof of Humanity, I'm looking at all the hundreds of impact DAOs that we found. To me, the problem is that the design space, we have the tools. The problem is that the talent and the capital are not focused on those tools. They're focused on vegetable farms. They're focused on chasing the highest yield. And so the big opportunity for me feels like, how can we plant in the minds of 100,000 degens this idea that the best yields come from going into Regen Web3 projects, into the Regen network, into Proof of Humanity, into impact DAOs? Because what that does is it upregulates those projects, allows them to scale their capital. It gives sustainable yields. I mean, assuming these impact DAOs are more sustainable and anti-fragile than things like FTX and, like the YAM Finance Ponzi. It gives them stronger yields. It gives us all a legitimate use of crypto. The financials should be a means to an end, not an end in themselves, in my opinion. And it just feels like it solves problems for all the different actors in the ecosystem. But I don't know how to make that case to the degens, because I think as soon as they hear social impact, it sounds like woo-woo to them, or it sounds like something where they're going to lose their money. And so creating that connective tissue, I think is what feels like the work ahead of us. So I don't know any reaction to that, but that's at least how I'm thinking about it.
It's interesting. We're facing this right now with this campaign we have called Cosmos Zero, And the goal is just to get protocols and validators to take
Yeah.
responsibility and offset their footprint. They have a footprint. Let's just be honest here. But what is getting people to participate isn't climate altruism, as I would describe it. It's that there's going to be a liquid pool of carbon. It's that there's going to be rewards. It's that they could do a native token swap. It's all of these financialization mechanisms. And so I think we have to be, as people inside the impact space, unafraid to utilize capitalistic language in order to draw them in. And I think we just have to come up with a better strategy of like, cool, degen regen is a meme. But like, how many people really care about that? It's only us making fun of them and like isolating ourselves with that meme. I'm more interested in like, how do we really tell a financialization story for ecological systems and the social impact of those ecological systems? Because to me, you know, that single drumbeat, and this is what I woke up to at Occupy, this is the gift that it gave me that keeps on giving, is that the climate collapse is the only thing worth putting my time, my energy, and my money into. And if I was so independently wealthy that I could fund everything, I freaking would, even if I only got 1%. But it's really a social evolution. It's really like a mental architecture evolution that we have to be proactive about. And that's why I always tell people I used to work for JP Morgan. They take the conversation more seriously when they know I had all those licenses. So I always lead with that because it disarms them and makes them realize that I was them, but I chose to apply those skills to a different problem solution set than necessarily the one that they have with their balance sheets. And I'm game. So like, we should do this. Not just talk about it, but like find a way to do these things.
I do have like one group of really close degen friends of mine, and it's kind of rare for me to have that experience of like trying to instill or advocate for principles that really matter to me, but to feel like there's this kind of nihilism in the degen space that's just like, yeah, cool. Like, have you seen this like stick man? It's the latest one that I'm shilling. And it's been really hard for me because I'm so earnest. It like actually required me to actually become, to let go and be like, okay, if you guys want to do that, I'll be over here building this stuff. If you ever want to come hang out, you're welcome to. And there's this real question of like, what is value? What is valuable? And in this sort of nihilistic degen space, it's like, well, whatever, anything can be valuable, instead of like community is valuable, a healthy living earth is valuable. And so I don't know how you make that bridge.
I think the bridge is being built. This is just, I'm going to add some financialization information here. One, the SEC now requires everything listed on the exchanges to report true ESG and to true carbon data information. And really, from a corporate sustainability and corporate finance perspective, carbon is now an asset on the balance sheet. The more carbon that goes onto the balance sheet, which I actually think is the more important financial intervention than companies offsetting, the more, and this is where I'm totally on the same team as Gregory, wholeheartedly admitting that out loud, I do believe that as corporations and nation states put the value of ecology on balance sheets, the system re-architects itself. So to me, that's like the linchpin in the situation, that if you pull it out, the whole dam blows. But that takes a long time for people to make brave choices at corporate levels. And I think that looking at what is it that we value and how and why is a conversation we need to have in a more mathematical and forthright fashion than we currently do. We can't lead with, hey, climate doom, or hey, impact good. We need to lead with dollars and cents and be okay doing that, because it transforms and composts capital into the system that we think it ought to be. But that drives from first principles. And so I go back to, do we all have the same drumbeat? Can we define our principles and have multiple strategies to that aim, depending on who you are and what you bring to the table?
I don't think of Web3 as having the same drumbeat. I may be abusing your analogy, but it feels like an orchestra. In you know, as long as we're all playing different instruments, and that there's a symphony that's developed between all of them, then it feels good. Yeah. Well, so we only have 4 more minutes until the bottom of the hour. So I'm wondering, if y'all have anything else to say in closing, and if there's anything that I didn't ask you that y'all want to say.
I think I love the kind of the paradox here, because I think that there's something about the financialization of carbon and of social impact that I think Occupy did a better job than Web3 has so far of questioning the underlying values systems of capitalism itself. And I don't want to go off on a whole tangent now, but there's this notion of energy blindness. Nate Hagens does incredible work on this. That basically a large amount of the value that we're able to extract from the natural world is the product of millions of years of stored carbon in the ground. And so we're actually taking from an energy store without replenishing it. And so we've basically created an inflated value system where we think we can make things for cheaper than we actually can, because we're not factoring in the millions of years that it took for that carbon to become in that form. And so it feels like we're actually running up against like a very material structural wall around value. And I think that could be a really rude awakening for a lot of people when it starts to become harder to extract that energy, and energy costs go up, and then costs of everything go up. And so I think we're in this very narrow window right now where we're not being forced to radically change those value systems, but I think we will be. And so I don't know that we're going to need to make as much of the financialization argument once it becomes really clear that we've so vastly extended beyond the carrying capacity of the earth that we're no longer able to produce things at the cost that we currently have been. And that's just going to send so many different things into totally chaotic systems chaos before they recalibrate to a new basin. And so, yeah, I would love to see more like deeper conversations about the nature of value in the Web3 space. And I appreciate this conversation, like bringing that ethos like back into my awareness.
It's a really good point. I think I want to leave everyone with a little bit of hope, and this is going to be better suited for those that are able to watch on YouTube. So for anyone who's listening, you should go see this on YouTube. I have some real art from Occupy I would like to show you, because I am a hoarder of, important historical artifacts from the journey. Oh yeah, and I want to make some points. So this is a print of the March Across the Brooklyn Bridge by a wonderful artist named Lopi the Row, very good friend of mine, I've seen a long time. But if you look at this print, that front line is women. And I think here in Web3, we need to have more women, more non-binary people, more people of color using these tools with us, because occupations and evolutions are often driven by women and those who are marginalized. So on their behalf, I want to show beautiful art that represents that. In Occupy, if you looked under the hood, there were a lot more women in Occupy than there is in Web3 or in tech in general. So I want to show you a couple more things, because I totally am a true occupier that hoards the original journals. This is my favorite picture of the whole occupation in one of the newspapers. It's like this young radical activist couple, I don't even know who they are, kissing. And I just want to remind folks that the love of ourselves, love of our communities, love of possibility is a true driving force and a first principle that I think is really important. I should think this is like the sweetest photo I ever saw. So I didn't keep the rest of the newspaper. I literally just like kept this page as an example.
Photo. But I'll also say that there's something visceral that hits to see the Wall Street Journal, but it's called the Occupied Wall Street Journal. Yes. I love that mimetically.
Great culture hacking.
I know, totally. They had this epic journal club, and this might make some terrible audio as I open this, but I have the General Strike edition filled with art and different posters. So I want to show you a couple of them here, because I think that we don't do enough climate joy. We don't do enough art as activism in Web3. We do art as commodification. But do we just make art to raise money? Do we just make art to like emancipate people from the drudgery of their daily lives? I don't know that we use art as an essence in the same way that Occupy Wall Street did. We use art as capitalism. And there are just, I want to find just this one last one, because I know this is sort of me in a piece of paper pile. But this one is so beautiful and in a language I can't even read, and so peaceful. So I want to see us create climate joy, climate art, climate activism, and be totally unafraid to be weird and wonderful and let more of that vulnerability out in Web3. And to me, when art is just seeping out of our pores, then I will probably personally feel like Occupy and Web3 are more of the same shared lived experience than I currently do. So thanks for letting me show you my relics that I've kept for a decade, folded peacefully in a drawer to keep them safe.
So if you're listening, we'll have a link to the YouTube in the show notes where you can check out the last 5 minutes in which Sarah shows us her beautiful art. But I also think that your audio voiceover as you're talking to them is worthwhile for audio listeners as well. So thank you for sharing that.
My pleasure. Thanks for letting me share.
This has been a really amazing conversation. Appreciate the thoughtfulness and the care that went into preparing for it. And also just the fact that we took a low nuance conversation on Twitter and brought it into a high nuance place here. So thanks to the listeners for listening, and Sarah and Benjamin, thank you for joining.
Thank you for having us. Yeah, thank you for holding space.